Good evening, everyone. My name's Sarah McDougall. I'm Director of Scholarship at Benery Gallery and Museum, and I'm really delighted to welcome you to the second of our series of talks accompanying our current exhibition, Lancelot Ribeiro, Heads in and Out of Our Time, co-curated by Marsha and myself. And Marsha is seated in front of three of the very select works at the gallery. So anyone who hasn't had a chance to visit yet, we'd love to have you visit. We're in the last 3 weeks of the show now, and we're open Wednesdays to Fridays. So following on from last week's talk, which Marsha did for us, introducing us to her father and his work from a very personal angle, this evening she's going to talk to us about the roots of the Indian artists collectives. And I'm really looking forward to learning more about the context of how this was set up and how Ribeiro and indeed all the others fitted into it. So I've taken on presenting Marsha's slides, and she will give me a prompt when I need to move them on. So now over to you, Marsha.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for the invitation to speak about the Indian Artists Collectives. I thought I would just explain why I have my interest in this. Essentially, it started as a side project for me, but very quickly became a bit of a passion project, and partly that's because so many of the artists were household names, really, as I was growing up. So there were people we knew and we would see in my father's Belsize Park Gardens studio. And it's something I've been wanting to do for a while, because what I've realized is that the voices that sit in my father's archive really tell the inside story and tells the story of this really powerful movement in their voices, essentially. So sometimes those voices are in conversation, sometimes in argument, but it's something personally I found fascinating. So Sarah, could we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. And I thought I'd just start with kind of the challenge that I faced. It was trying to disentangle a fairly confusing story, and so I put together this snapshot slide, which is really based on the groups and the exhibitions that were mentioned really in my father's archive. And you can see that there are a multitude of groups, of events, exhibitions, festivals, and I realized when I looked at usually the external literature on this, most of it treated the groups as a kind of as disparate, unconnected groups. And my own feeling is that that's a mistake, actually, because there is certainly that's apparent in the archive. There has been evidence of a steady movement from 1963 to 30 years later. But the movement, the Indian Painters Collective that started in 1963 went through various iterations. It evolved, it was fluid with members, they reconfigured, they had spurts of activity, and what I previously thought were spurts of inactivity. I've kind of realized of late, looking at my father's diaries, that actually these artists were still very active behind the scenes, trying to bring in patrons and funding to their mission. So it's an incredibly, I guess, a roller coaster story to how to their successes and and achievements and hurdles they had to overcome. And some of the events have got listed below. Now, those strictly fell under the collective's umbrella, if you like, but others were done, were separate initiatives. But I've included a mention of a few of these in my talk, because I think it was really telling of the receptiveness to South Asian art and its cultural heritage over the period that you know, that the collectives had their heyday, I guess. So just to outline my own approach in this is I've studied manifestos, minutes, exhibition ephemera, and more recently some of the sound recordings of the artists talking to one another. I also sought really since 2012 to gain first-hand testimonies. So I interviewed some of the original members of the group in its earliest form, people like Mali and people like Balraj Khanna, as well as individuals who were instrumental in furthering their cause. And that was, you know, and I'll say something about them in a moment, but the High Commissioner of India's Salman Haider, and then the ex-V&A keeper of the Indian section, Robert Skelton. They also helped give me some context here. And then the other area that really gave me a route map, I guess, through this complicated history was the archive of the late Ibrahim Wagh. And I owe a debt of gratitude to his wife for granting me access to that, because he was meticulous in terms of his documentation. So what certainly seemed apparent to me is that a concept that was conceived by four young painters, you know, it went through its hurdles, but through the next 30 years, it then gradually acquired more members, and by the close, by the kind of, I guess it's at the end of that period, it had 30 artist members and some of its first female members. So Sarah, could we go to the next slide? Thank you. So this wonderful photograph, I realized was taken in the back garden of a house in Golders Green. And these are the four young painters who've now become 7. And many of the stories and associations of these young men started back in Bombay. And I've spoken to them to a couple of them individually to also find out their artistic journeys. And perhaps that's what's entrenched my fascination on this subject. So they're gathered here in a flat, toasting the formation of the collective. And what's really interesting is that the average age of these young painters is 27. My father on the left, Lancelot Ribeiro, is the oldest, he's 30. And standing next to him, the tall man in a grey suit, Balraj Khanna, is the youngest at the age of 23. They represent different artistic forms and come from different backgrounds. Some of them had their beginnings in the dramatic or literary arts and came to painting later on. Many had won acclaim back in India. Some had come with silver or gold medals, traveling to the UK with scholarships. And each had some notable exhibition history in India and abroad under their belt. So next slide, please. Now this document is really the circular, the formation where they outline their ambitions essentially. And I just want to pick out 2 or 3 sentences that really struck me, because there's a kind of youthful determinism in this document, and it contrasts quite sharply with the tone that then begins to creep in much later on. So they sought to represent a wide field of young Indian painters and help present their work in a way that would give a positive idea of contemporary painting in India. So this is in 1964. They sought to have their own exhibitions at regular intervals and submit their members' work for other exhibitions. And finally, they hoped that all participants would work to strengthen the group and make it progressive. So there's a real spirit of generosity here. And And I think this was a lovely kind of setting stone, I suppose, to then what transpired. And if we go to the next slide. What I wanted to do is pick out really, and now this is from the Lancelot Ribeiro Archive, but I wanted to give you a sense of some of the seminal exhibitions that took place under the umbrella of the collectives. So the boxes with black writing are over the period my father was a member. So he actually withdrew from the collectives in 1980. But I felt, you know, a kind of analysis of the collectives wouldn't be complete if I didn't mention what happened after that. So the exhibitions in red, shown here in red, come from Ibrahim Vagh's archive here. And I think what was another common thread really is that many of these artists have come together because they'd experienced the kind of the barriers within the commercial gallery scene, and you know, and felt collectively their chances of success would be, you know, would be stronger. And I suppose the question that was on the back of my mind is, you know, would these seminal exhibitions have happened if these artists had not kind of taken the steps to ensure they did, had waited for the establishment essentially. And I think you will see by my archival photographs just how influential they were, you know. So next slide, please, Sarah. Now, I know this looks a little messy, but it is essentially, it's providing a new layer of information. So I've still got the previous collectives exhibitions that shown here, but now in these orange boxes, I wanted to show what was happening, you know, nationally in terms of supporting South Asian arts and South Asian culture. And there is this is arranged chronologically, but there is a kind of common denominator here. It's quite often Commonwealth Institute and organizations like the Tagore India Tea Center pushing for an awareness about arts and an awareness about music and poetry and culture, India's cultural heritage. There is strong support from the High Commissioners and India House. And that what certainly is apparent in when I examine some of the programs is that they're drawing in individuals who can contextualize Indian culture within India's long artistic heritage. So people like the former keeper of the India section of the V&A, Dr. William Archer, and then Robert Skelton, his successor, and others, you know, who are passionate about India. People like George Butcher, the art critic for The Guardian, and Philip Rawson, who was a founder curator of Durham's Gulbenkian Museum of Oriental Art, and they feature again in later events. But it was a heady time over the 1960s and 70s for these artists. And by the kind of latter part of that period, they're then bringing in patrons. Someone like Lord Swaraj Paul was a key patron of the Indian collectives by that point. And just to add, you know, a further layer, you know, I'd like kind of people to bear in mind that these artists also have, outside of what you see on the screen, their own personal commitments, their own solo exhibitions, their own group exhibitions. So you can see just, you know, how admirable it really is that they're dedicating their time to pushing forth the cause as a collective here. So if we go to the next slide, please. Thank you. And again, this is a summary slide, but you can see that over that period, from the initial 4 in 1963, just before they worded that their manifesto. Over that period, you know, that by 1981 they had nearly 30 members. And I'm not even sure yet if my documentation on this is complete, because I've only begun to really scratch the surface here. So I'm still kind of in research mode here. But I think what was evident to me is that over those subsequent waves of expansion, it was nothing but easy. I mean, there were petty squabbles, there were you know, clashes of personalities, and what I noticed throughout the whole course is that only 2 of the artists stayed the course, and that was Ibrahim Wagh and Mali. So the others dropped out, or sometimes dropped out and rejoined at a later date. And my father, when I was looking at a quotation in 1973, so he refers to this kind of the problems that beset the group. So 16 painters, which was one of their first achievements, had made something of a splash, but the group didn't last. Partly it broke up because some of the artists went back to teaching or commercial jobs. Partly it was all kinds of petty niggling things which developed, as they always seem to develop with Indian groups. And when I spoke to the painter Baraj Khanna, he was more to the point. He said, getting artists together is like partition all over again. So yeah, I wanted to just give you that bit of context. But now if we go to the next slide, let's go to the first achievement that they had here. And I've used the quote from, you know, I guess one of the key supporters here, from Salman Haider, who supported their cause for having a show at India House. And these are his words: seeking opportunity, not concessions, which I think mirrors the tone of that initial circular. And then, so just to clarify, Salman Haider, Ambassador Salman Haider was the former, he was a junior official in the culture section of India House at the time. And he described what transpired. So I've got a quote here on the next slide, please. So he describes, a group of young men burst in with Lance in the lead and told me I had to organize an exhibition of their work at India House, seeking opportunity, not concessions. They exemplified the freshly awakened pride of a new nation, and India House was rapidly infused by their enthusiasm. And I thought, just through some visual slides now, I wanted to give you a sense of what that show was like, using Salman Haider's recollections. And just to bear in mind, those 6 painters that put on this exhibition, you know, aside from producing the work, they became curators, art installers. They took hold of comms and PR. So if we go for the next slides, you'll get a sense of what it was like on the day. And my thanks here to Ibrahim Wagh's estate, really, for granting me access here. So Salman starts, everything for the exhibition had to be done by the artists themselves. Next slide, please. They labored hard to make panels, to hang the paintings, arranged lights scrounged from the inner depths of India House. Next slide. Spruced up the exhibition hall, printed a catalogue. And by the way, this photograph here was one that allowed me to identify. Sorry, I think that's a sound. Is there a sound issue? Sarah, I wonder.
Sorry, I think I'm on mute. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Right. The sound is a little bit coming and going. So I think if you can just stay very close to your microphone,
Okay.
hopefully that'll be fine. And apologies to anybody who's having any difficulty. And thank you, Marsha, for bearing with the technical side.
Okay. Okay, please let us know if there are any sound issues as I continue. Okay, so Salman's recollections are that the painters spruced up the exhibition hall and printed a catalogue. And that catalogue you can see in the hands of one visitor in blue, and that actually allowed me to identify my father at the Six Indian Painters. And I'm delighted to say that that painting behind him is on display at Tate's Britain at the moment. So the next slide, please. So they also drew in the media, played host to the many guests, and produced a fine exhibition of modern Indian art where nobody had ever thought of having one. So in the top left photograph, there is Dr. Jivraj Mehta, the Indian High Commissioner, and he was president of the Tagore India Centre, which was a centre that sought to promote Indo-British cultural relations. And they did this essentially through UK scholarships and lectureships and providing practical help to Indian artists, writers, and teachers. And he's pictured there with Jenny Lee, who had just become Britain's first arts minister in October 1964, so a month before this exhibition. And Barraj recalled her being there and said, I remember, she said, these works could only be painted by Indian artists. I don't know if that was true or not, but I think she was trying to be polite and pleasant. So next slide. So I mentioned that there were wider initiatives that were supporting South Asia's cultural heritage. And I just picked out around 3 that I just wanted to highlight because, you know, I thought these were fascinating. So can we look at the first one? I call this, you know, I've referred to as getting into the Royal Festival Hall almost, because this was an approach that the group made to the organisers of the Commonwealth Arts Festival in 1965. It was a 3-week festival and it had 2 elements to it. One was Treasures of the Commonwealth exhibition at the Royal Academy, and the other one was a contemporary art of the Commonwealth, but a focus on Indian art, curated by their old friend George Butcher at the Royal Festival Hall. And reading this letter, the artistic administrator responds sympathetically and tries to be helpful by saying, essentially, that if you can manage to get in touch with George Butcher, who is in India at that time, perhaps, you know, there is a chance, but, you know, the subtext is there is a very slim chance of them being included in this festival. But the other option he suggests is if they can manage to secure an exhibition in a London gallery under their own resources within the next few days, that would be another way. And, you know, that was nearly impossible. But just imagine if this had happened on the back of 6 Indian painters. The profile it would have given them would have been astonishing, I think. But next slide, please. But what I think is astonishing is there is this, and I found this, it's a fairly modest and unexciting catalogue on the right, which referred to the Arts of India in exhibition in 1966. And I've been working with the curator from Towner to see if we can uncover more. And actually, about a year ago, I was convinced there must be some more paperwork around. There must be some more information and perhaps some press. And she had her volunteers working on it. And then suddenly I got an excited email saying, you won't believe it, we found the box. And partly the story had been hidden, I suppose, because Towner had relocated from its initial premises to, you know, its state-of-the-art building in Eastbourne. So suddenly we uncovered this, and, you know, to my surprise, I found the 6 Indian Painters catalogue inside, and I thought, how wonderful, you know. And it was really an exhibition that was ahead of its time, because it was showing, it claimed to show some 400 years of Indian art. So it had secured loans from the V&A, And this included paintings from the 16th century, sculptures from the 3rd century, and bronzes from the 13th century. It had a contemporary art section of 11 artists, and that included my father and his brother Sousa, Sadnan Bakri, M.F. Hussain, and also other members who would become members of the collectives later on. So Avinash Chandra, Faraj Khanna, and others essentially. But you can see that it was, it was a wonderful juxtaposition here. And they had the support of India House, so, the Commonwealth Institute as well, and a couple of commercial galleries. And they'd enlisted individuals like Philip Rawson and George Butcher to contextualize this event within India's long artistic heritage. So we're still in the process of this archaeological dig, and we hope to uncover more over the coming year. But next slide, please. And here now, again, this is purely from my father's archive, but it gives you a sense of what else there was happening over the 1970s. So artists now, and this is outside of the collective movement, but it's, it certainly helped their cause. So the Commonwealth Institute was putting on lectures that had an outreach program to inform and educate about the music and arts of India. And that's when my father gave two lectures, one on his own work and one on early arts of India as well. And it was 2 different age groups as well. So, a very kind of strong educational push. Artists were included in the 1973 Brighton Festival, and that's that yellow poster you can see on the slide. And then there was and again, I've got very little information about it, but there was something that strikes me as quite remarkable. In 1974, 4 international artists, so again, not part of the collectors, but 4 invited artists to show their work, which combined V&A loans of early art, and it's part of UNESCO's international, the UNESCO-sponsored International Art Week. And I found letters that refer to conferences on modern South Asian studies that were written to my father. And now whether he participated in that, I've yet to find out. Again, another question I hope will be answered in due course. So next slide, please. So now coming back to the collectives, the Mandir Gallery was this wonderful initiative, which was basically, it was run by a friend of the members of the Indian Painters Collective, who had, he was an owner of an Indian vegetarian restaurant and had experience of working with galleries in partnership with a local hotel. And in this Mandir restaurant on Tottenham Court Road, they opened a gallery and a hall for drama, and the members of the Indian Painters Collective essentially became curators and art installers again. So there were a number of events that they would hold here and bring in their patrons and entertain, and produce catalogues, host group events and evenings. And they saw it when I spoke to one of the painters, and that was Marley, who we will be interviewing in due course. He explained to me it was seen as a way of promoting their work, but also the work of UK-based contemporary artists. And the next slide, I think, shows you this wonderful dinner that they held. And I interviewed the Richard Blurton from the British Museum some time ago, actually. I was asking him, did he have recollections of the group? And he remembered the Mandir Gallery, and he said, he described to me, it was the cheapest restaurant in London in Tottenham Court Road. They had a separate gallery and would often clear out the room for concerts or exhibitions. On the opening of their group show, they had a special evening, I understand, from talking to Mali and checking Ibrahim Vagh's diary records, they had an evening with Ravi Shankar, and even the Beatles attended. So unfortunately, not in this photograph. Okay, next slide, please. And this is a lovely informal shot of the artists gathered together at their inaugural opening, and this is in June 1974. The next slide, please. Now, I've referred to this as 13 long years later. Now, those aren't my words. Those are the words of the later manifestos that the group worded. And I think it gives you a sense of how far they think they've come. And if we go to next slide. Okay. So now I noticed when I was reading through again the material that there's a tone of militancy and defiance that begins to really creep in, and there's a common story that they make a point of making clear that they've come together because they've all had individual struggles, and they describe it as each member with his own tale to tell, having come up against closed shop tactics and a hard wall of chauvinistic zeal. But I think that, through that, they're still visionary in their outlook. They've broadened up their membership, they've widened their base, and they're carrying out an outreach program. And so they've got this kind of three-tiered approach to membership, with full members subscribing at £20 per annum, a professional artist living and working in the UK, of Indian origin, having had one successful solo exhibition. And the professional full members would be vetted by majority voting. Associate membership for art students and others who pay £5 per annum, and patrons whose fees would be waived, but they would receive an endorsement in all IAUK activities. And throughout this period, looking at the archive, certainly Ibrahim Wagh was making approaches to the Commission for Racial Equality and the Arts Council. And looking at my father's diaries for 1977, 78, 79, there are regular meetings. So clearly they're seeking support, they're seeking wider recognition and funding. And if we go to the next slide. So it's this, I guess, manifesto that really announces the expansion of membership, and they've expanded it to 9 members. And they explain it as, again, commonly shared sense of frustration for the individual struggles against the barriers that exist in this truculently chauvinistic art world here. And what they're seeking here, it's kind of, again, that militant tone, so recognition that collectively they will stand a better chance of success. They want their members to be considered on a par with their British contemporaries and have the same rights to the amenities and facilities available to their Indigenous counterparts. And what this ends on a positive note, that they've actually secured their own base. So a gallery for South Asian artists in South Audley Street. And next slide, please. Now, this is the point where they return to India House, and the 6 Indian painters now have become 4 leading Indian painters, Indian artists. And they rename their group. So again, it's in the documentation, but it's now called IAUK, so Indian Artists UK. At the back is Balraj, and in the middle Ibrahim and my father Ribeiro, and in front is Mali. Next slide, please. Now I found these wonderful photographs. Again, this is thanks to Ibrahim Ibrahim's collection of the 4 leading Indian artists evening, essentially. They had the support of the High Commissioner.
Sorry, Marsha, I'm losing you a little there. If you're able to face the camera, it seems to come out much stronger.
Oh, okay, sorry. Can you see? Is that better?
That's perfect.
Okay. All right. My apologies. Okay, so next slide, please. So this is a wonderful color shot that I found in my father's collection of 4 leading Indian artists as well. So you can see very well attended and very strong recognition for the group and for the work of IAUK. Okay, next slide. But the support that they got from the High Commissioner was also, you know, it was also in terms of kind of building alliances, I guess. And so they had this wonderful party that was held at the High Commissioner's residence, and Barraj described this to me. It was a very grand house now in Kensington Palace Gardens. The whole lot of London came. For us, it was a great party. Some galleries were invited, and at least 3 of them turned up. I mean, this was name of bringing in a select group of guests and promoting the group. And I believe they took 2 or 3 paintings each. I mean, certainly that's what my father had noted in his diary. So next slide. Now, I found I've only got very limited references to the Rainbow Art Group in my father's archive, but I'd seen that they were trying to build connections with the Minorities Arts Advisory Service and Nasim Khan of that. And I believe that Nasim Khan was able to provide gallery leads, funding advice, and help with exhibitions over 1978 and 1979. And I picked out a quote from the program, which I realize is very difficult to read, but I thought this was really telling. So Mas recognized the difficulty artists face in getting their work considered seriously and supported through established channels, and admired after its own merits, not because it happens to be that of an ethnic minority. And this is really what is becoming apparent now. Members in the group are showing their unhappiness with being pigeonholed as ethnic artists. And perhaps, you know, that's one of the reasons why some of the members, including my father, decided to withdraw. So next slide, please. Now, by 1979, 1980, they've managed to secure funding from India House and the Commission for Racial Equality to produce this wonderful set of, this wonderful collection, brochure, if you like, of IAUK, the Indian Artists Group. And it's now 9 members have their biographies on one side. And if you go to the next slide, you know, prominent artwork on the other side, and it's a glossy pack that is used for, you know, for promotion. And drawing to really the close of my father's time with the collectives, and so I guess my you know, my material on the movement itself in 1980, we come to the Berghaus exhibition, which we'll see in the next few slides. So this flyer, which I'm still delighted is framed in Berghaus and on display. Really, I mean, it was this event, exhibition of paintings. It was more than that. The IAUK group and my father's notes particularly show it was intended to be an Indian month. So it was more than just an exhibition. And if we look at the next slide, please. So this lovely handwritten program, which we wouldn't find nowadays, but on the back it has my father's opening speech. But it really makes clear that this was an Indian month. This was about promoting art and poetry, and music, as well as a taste and learn session. And they had 3 Indian poets participating: Farooq Dondi, Hubert Nazareth, and Melanie Silgado. And my father's opening talk, I just picked out a couple of sentences. So he addressed the audience in Berg House and said, IAUK is made up of Indian artists, most of whom have been resident in Britain for almost a couple of decades. They have lived and worked here in their individual capacities, trying very hard indeed to penetrate seemingly impregnable barriers. And essentially he implies in a system hell-bent on ignoring them. So, you know, that defiance, that militancy, that sense of disappointment as to where they had got to 13 long years later really comes out in that talk, I think. But can we go to the next slide? But, you know, as I've kind of looked at the Berg House exhibition, I've realized, I guess, the more I uncovered and looked through the paper trail, you know, that they had managed to secure widespread support, not just from the Indian High Commissioner and the Commission for Racial Equality, but they had their first patron, Lord Paul. They had, you know, engaged experts in the field to contextualize, and again, Robert Skelton and Philip Rawson were prominent speakers. And they had, you know, they had pretty good coverage. And this photograph is taken from India Weekly, but they were also on BBC Asia. And that's something I hope to be able to locate at some point in the BBC's archives. And the next slide shows the painters with VIPs. And one more slide, please. And here, Robert Skelton is on the left in the raincoat, and Dr. Singh from the High Commissioner is on the right. My father's in the middle. And next slide, please. So after 1980, well, this is where my understanding really starts to kind of trail off in a way. But I think I'm beginning to kind of scratch scratch deeper into this, uncover more information, just looking at some of the documents that were produced. And I found this brochure in Ibrahim Vagh's collection in the next slide. It's a wonderful glossy new revised pack. And again, it sort of reiterates that point about pigeonholing, saying our work should be evaluated as the work of any other artist practicing his profession in this country, and not as that of an Indian artist working in a foreign country. And I think, you know, that what really struck me is how they've now got a revised structure, you know, that's really sophisticated. So they have 4 key patrons, including Lord Paul. They have a president, an executive committee, a general secretary, joint secretaries, a treasurer, and a public relations officer. And their art sections now have expanded. So they've included not just fine art, but graphic design, industrial design, architecture, and film. And if we go to the next slide, I found this wonderful, effectively, the storyboard again, which is a story I think that, you know, I hope one day researchers will be able to dig deeper into. But I think it's this, you know, it does give you a sense of that achievement when they secured their first premises for Indian artists. And I, you know, again, I wanted to share it with you because I think while my archival material ends really in 1980, it's clear to me that the collectives were still, you know, very progressive and very successful in trying to kind of push forward their cause and widen the exposure and have that, you know, secure patrons as well, and continue to overcome barriers. And there were a number of barriers. I think this South Audley Street, they had to vacate after, certain problems came to light and a withdrawal of funding. And if we go to the next slide, they found another gallery space, the Horizon Gallery in Bloomsbury, which had a fairly short-lived, existence. But over that time, they managed to put on 4 in-focus exhibitions, which were held in parallel, and perhaps even in protest to the Hayward Gallery is the other story. But then issues of damp and rising rent and overheads really, kind of came to a head, and the gallery closed in 1991. And my final slide shows, again, what an achievement between 2 cultures at the Barbican in 1992. And my hope is that we can also interview the painter Marley on this, because the IAUK proposal for the Barbican show was to invite 20 established artists. Some of those would be established names, and some of those would be young, talented newcomers, new artists. And what it really sought to challenge was this kind of archaic, glorified image of India's past, while failing to acknowledge, the work of contemporary artists in Britain. And the title, Between Two Cultures, I think is a really nice point to end this presentation, because their intention was, they wanted to draw attention really to the present and to the future, and give that message that art is universal and global. And it's with that point that I could turn over to you, Sarah, but yeah.
Thank you so much, Marsha. I shall get myself back on the screen, and I'll just leave that up as a lovely visual backdrop to us speaking. Oh, sorry, I've done one. Busy fingers there. I'm hoping that we'll have some lovely questions in the chat, but I thought I would just kick off with a couple of things. So firstly, you mentioned that your father left the collective in 1980.
Yeah.
Obviously, as we just saw, things continued. So why was it that he decided to leave at that point?
So my understanding on this has kind of been informed actually relatively recently, because I have been listening to sound recordings between my father and Ibrahim Wagh from around 1979, 1980. And it's clear that there are problems that are appearing, in a way, ever since the group expanded. And I think that was an issue of a clash of personalities, for one thing. And certainly my father's perspective was he felt that the group had maybe lost direction, but had lost, had lost its way from its, original kind of ambition in the 1963, 1964 grouping. And I can sense a frustration that's shared with Ibrahim as well, because they're very frustrated that, there seems to be a sort of lack of direction and this conflict of personality. And I've certainly seen in my father's writings to his brother Sousa that he talks about the difficulties that the groups are facing. And his brother even advises, he says, I can quite understand you getting het up by this, but my advice to you is to stay in the group and play it like a game of chess. And even Ibrahim says to him, don't resign, whatever you do, don't resign. It's better to fight within the group than to leave disheartened, essentially. But my father did, and he decided he just, it wasn't, I think he was not happy with the way it was heading, essentially.
I think you mentioned early on a sort of a quote about how really this applies to all artists who get together, that very soon all the things they have in common sort of get overcome by the things where they're going their separate ways, and inevitably there are sort of conflicts and so on, which of course is really understandable.
Well, what was really interesting in the conversations between on these sound recordings is that both artists felt, well, okay, they had their differences even in the 60s, but they worked it out as a group. They managed to kind of navigate through those difficulties. But by the late 70s, I think the problem was that, sometimes they felt some of the members weren't putting in the hard graft, essentially, while others, and I would say, someone like Ibrahim Wagh was a bit of an unsung hero on the collectives because he was tirelessly campaigning. And I think when I was speaking to his wife, she said something which made me feel rather sad, but I think he often neglected his own work to the greater cause. And I think later on in life, perhaps he felt he'd given too much of himself for that, So.
So I also like very much the phrase you used of an archaeological dig, which I think you were referring particularly to the wonderful serendipitous things that came up at the Towner, which was marvelous to know that these things do come up,
Yes.
years later when you're searching for them. But I guess you could, in a sense, describe your whole process for this as that, and it's one which kind of keeps on giving you new artifacts, clearly. And there's two approaches here. There's everything that you've been able to share with us, but there's also the story of your own archaeology in that sense. If you just wanted to talk a little bit more about that, I'll end the slideshow so that
I mean, I absolutely love that process because, in a sense, I guess has been the trigger for me writing my father's story. And as I said, out of that emerged my interest and my passion for this other story that I feel hadn't been, appreciated on the collectives. And it is that, it's suddenly finding, having a meeting, looking through the archives of various museums, and then finding a piece of paper that maybe resonates with me, and then kind of gives me that feeling that something more must exist. It's wonderful. And I know the Towner curator, it has been mentioned, because what I was really hoping to find as well are the images of that Arts of India exhibition. And apparently there is a box of 7,000 slides, and but I can imagine, I just somehow there's a feeling that all I need is maybe to find something that just I recognize in the work of, say, one of the artists that will be a kind of indicator. But you're right, the whole process is a process of discovery, and and I think that's what I really want to bring out in the work that I do, and not that these are multi-layered narratives, really. So you kind of get a sense of a process, an exhibition, or a movement like the collectives movement from different angles, and and sometimes it's kind of these competing voices, but I think that really adds to perhaps that feeling of life that's within a story,
Yes, and
it's a living history, essentially.
Yes. Because you also mentioned, and I am just keeping the questions going because I'm sure people will be thinking of their own, or else they're just hanging on your every word. But please do put your questions in the chat. So I'm very happy to share them. But meantime, while we're waiting for those, you also mentioned about barriers in the commercial gallery scene earlier. One of the motivators for coming together, and I wondered if you just wanted to say a little bit more about that.
So when I was initially looking into kind of, I was essentially interviewing Baraj Khanna and then Mali, about, you know, I suppose about their artistic journeys, not specifically about the collectives, but about their journeys. And they, you know, and it was this common story that was coming out about how, you know, sometimes a commercial gallery would promise something and then, you know, kind of back out of it last minute. And there are several instances in Ibrahim Wagh's memoirs that point to, you know, turning up at a gallery and then the person that they were supposed to see suddenly isn't available, or, you know, forgets about a promise, you know, that kind of thing. It's a real common story with most artists. And it was something, you know, I think I don't know if my father had that initially, but he certainly had it later, because some of the early gallery correspondence, or rather exhibition ephemera, suggests that he was pretty busy from, you know, as soon as he kind of had arrived in the UK. But certainly later on, I know there was always an issue of kind of, you know, banging his head against the wall, you know, with trying to get his works seen and getting exhibitions in place. So yeah, it's you know, and I think, but even when they enlarged to 9 members and then, you know, eventually 30 members, you look at the wording in the for the Barbican Between Two Cultures exhibition, and it's still an issue, you know, in the 1980s, and we know now it's still an issue, you know. So yeah.
Yes, and you mentioned, of course, obviously he had that, your father, I mean, had tremendous success when he first arrived,
Yeah.
and then, you know, success again at the end, and then this sort of difficult middle years, which I think again is common to many artists. There always seems to be an excitement around the newest, youngest members, and then the elder statesmen, if one can put it that way, and, you know, forgetting that often you know, artists are still innovating and producing very highly in those often difficult middle years. So, but, you know, great to see that the collectives in their various iterations, you know, did survive a long time, and, you know, despite the difficulties and having to come together, not always for good reasons,
Yeah,
things came out of it. And it's so marvelous, really, to have that all documented. The photographs and the catalogues are really, you know, such a valuable resource to future researchers as well.
yeah.
Well, Marsha, we've kept you for a very long time. It's been a really rich and full story as ever. And I'm incredibly grateful to you for your time this evening. I think our audience are just rapt there and shy of questioning. So perhaps they will write in with any questions they think of later. I'd like to wrap up by thanking Marsha, of course, for second marvellous talk in this series. And as Marsha said, we do hope to interview Marley at a later stage and make that available. We had originally hoped to arrange a live event for this week, and for various reasons that wasn't possible. But also do please join us this time next week, 6:30 next Wednesday, for Simon Lake's talk exploring Lancelot Ribeiro as an Indian expressionist. So we're very much looking forward to that talk as well, and I hope you can all join us again then. So thank you, Marsha, and do have a nice relaxing rest of the evening after all that information.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Oh, and just to thank you from a couple of people there, and we will share the video later.
Lovely. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Marsha.